The year is 1346. Across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, roughly 75 million people were alive. Villages were festive. Markets were loud. Churches overflowed with prayer. Children ran through the streets without a care. Nobody knew. But somewhere, far away, something had awakened, and it would bring with it the greatest catastrophe humanity had ever seen. This is the story of the Black Death, the plague that killed between 25 and 50 million people in just 7 years. The story not just of a disease, but of the end of an age. For centuries, scientists debated, where did the plague come from? Now we know. The Central Asian steppes, most likely present-day Kyrgyzstan, or the western borders of China. A bacterium called Yersinia pestis had existed here for tens of thousands of years. It slept among rodents, rarely causing trouble. But in the 1330s, something changed. Perhaps it was climate change. Perhaps drought pushed rodents closer to human settlements. The bacterium spread through fleas. Fleas jumped from rodents to humans, and the Silk Road provided the perfect highway for death. The Silk Road was the world's first global trade network. Silk, spices, gold, glass, and now something else. By 1343, strange reports of mass death began arriving from trading colonies along the Black Sea. Caravans were dying on the road. Bodies showed strange dark swellings, black marks on the skin. Merchants who saw these signs understood. Their only hope was to flee, but by fleeing, they carried death with them. Every trading stop became an execution ground. Every caravanserai, a chamber of death. 1346. The Crimean Peninsula, the city of Caffa, a wealthy Genoese trading outpost. Walled, powerful, and prosperous. The Mongol Golden Horde had laid siege to the city, but something strange was happening inside the Mongol camp. Soldiers were collapsing one by one, their bodies swelling, blackening, dead within days. The Mongol commander, Janibeg, made one of the most horrifying decisions in history. He ordered the corpses of plague victims to be loaded onto catapults and fired into the city. The Caffans threw the bodies into the sea, but it was too late. The plague was already inside, and the Genoese merchants boarded their ships, fleeing westward, going home. October 1347, the harbor of Messina, Sicily. Several ships arrived from the east. When the harbor officials boarded, they froze. Most of the crew was dead. The survivors had gone mad, their bodies covered in enormous black swellings, oozing blood and pus. The authorities immediately ordered the ships out of the harbor. But it was already too late. The rats had already climbed ashore with their flea-ridden coats into Sicily. Within days, people were collapsing dead in the streets. The Black Death had entered Europe. The plague killed in 3 forms. The first, bubonic plague, enormous black swellings in the lymph nodes, fever, convulsions, internal bleeding, a 60 to 80% kill rate. The second, septicemic plague. Bacteria entered the bloodstream. Organs failed. Skin rotted and turned black while the victim was still alive. This form was nearly 100% fatal. The third was the most terrifying. Pneumonic plague. It spread through the air, through breath, through a simple conversation. As long as you could breathe, you were whispering death to everyone around you. Medieval medicine had absolutely no answer. From Sicily, the plague moved to mainland Italy. From Italy to France. From France to Spain, Germany, England. In every city, the same scene played out. A neighbor healthy in the morning was dead by evening. A father healthy at night was swollen and dying by dawn. In Florence, 2/3 of the population vanished in a single year. Florence, one of the wealthiest, most populated, most cultured cities of the era. In Paris, the daily death toll exceeded 800. Sometimes, an entire neighborhood was erased within days. Bodies left in the village square had no one to collect them, because those who would have collected them had also died. The church bells rang so constantly that they finally stopped, because the sound was driving the survivors mad. People turned to God, but God was not answering. Priests visited the sick and died. Monks prayed and died. Pope Clement VI sat in Avignon surrounded by fires, believing the flames would purify the air. He survived, but 1/3 of Europe's clergy did not. Faith in the church collapsed. If this much prayer could not stop this much death, then perhaps God was not listening. This doubt planted the seeds of the Renaissance and the Reformation. Social order dissolved. The noble died. The slave died. The king died. Some people abandoned everything and began to celebrate wildly. Others fled their lands, and the worst of it, Jewish communities were accused of poisoning the wells. Massacres followed. The flagellants appeared. These were groups who believed they could wash away their sins through self-inflicted pain. They marched from city to city, flogging themselves in the streets. "We must suffer to please God," they cried. People watched. Some joined because they had no idea what else to do. The numbers must be spoken. In 7 years, from 1346 to 1353, between 30 and 50% of Europe's entire population was erased. 25 to 50 million people. In China, some estimates suggest half the population perished. The great cities of the Middle East suffered catastrophic losses. In total, global deaths are estimated between 75 and 200 million. This was not a war, not a genocide, just one tiny bacterium, and no one could stop it. By 1353, the plague had largely passed, but it returned. In 1361, in 1369, then again in 1374. But the survivors had been transformed. Labor had become scarce. Landowners were forced to offer better conditions to serfs and slaves. The foundations of the feudal system cracked. The idea of quarantine was born. Venice began holding plague ships for 40 days before allowing them to dock. They called this quarantena. That is where the word quarantine comes from. People who had stared death in the face began to look at life differently. Art exploded. Literature erupted. Philosophy awakened. The Renaissance was already waiting at the door. Born not in spite of the plague, but because of it. The Black Death is over, but it left its mark. The word quarantine comes from it. Modern medicine was born trying to understand it. Feudalism died because of it. The Renaissance rose from its ashes. Humanity faced its greatest catastrophe and survived. And did not merely survive, it transformed. Perhaps history is telling us something. The greatest fractures are always the beginning of the greatest transformations. The Black Death killed 25 to 50 million people, but those who remained rebuilt the world. And this story, this pain, this loss, this rebirth is still here, still alive, because history is not the story of the dead. It is the story of those who lived